Hey everybody, welcome to Beyond the Bench. We've got a really exciting guest for you all today. Z, co-founder and chief evangelist of Aeris Communications.
It started on my dining table, as I like to tell people. We sat down and scribbled out how we were going to send this data over analog cellular, acquiring that Ericsson IoT business where I kind of sort of described that as a minnow swallowing a whale. Any anomalous data is by definition suspicious until you prove otherwise. If you brick all your devices, the cost of trying to fix them later on is horrendous. $250 to $400 per truck roll.
What would you focus on if you were starting from ground zero again?
That's a darn good question. I think
Hi everybody, welcome to Beyond the Bench, where we discuss taking hardware through production and the stories along the way. My name is Bill Brock, CEO of Peridio, the ecosystem for building and maintaining advanced embedded products. Hey everybody, welcome to Beyond the Bench podcast, hardware stories that matter. We've got a really exciting guest for you all today. Z, co-founder and chief evangelist of Aeris Communications. He's been doing the IoT thing for decades and decades, and this is a really exciting opportunity for me to talk to a real industry expert. So Z, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Bill. I enjoy being here.
Absolutely. Well, for those of you, those in the audience that don't know Aeris or haven't met you yet, would you mind give us a little brief background and we can get into it?
Sure. A little bit on Aeris and then a little bit on myself. Aeris has been in the business of doing this since before the terms M2M and IoT even came into existence, for almost 30 years at this point. I'm one of the founders. Got into it when we had a capability that in the early analog AMP cellular days just simply allowed small amounts of data to be sent over the air, so to speak, from devices out in the field. We got started wondering what we could do with it, and we found a couple of large companies that were very interested in using us remotely all over the United States first, Canada, Mexico, and then eventually a couple decades later, migrated over to Europe. So we've been providing these kind of IoT capabilities and services for over almost 30 years.
Today minus 30. When did you start?
January 1996 was my official start date. I was one of the founders. There were six of us, and I was number 4.
Oh my gosh. What was it like back then?
Oh my God, that's an interesting thing. It started on my dining table, as I like to tell people. We sat down and scribbled out how we were going to send this data. And it took us about a year to get people excited. And we got our offices and got started and got our network going. And first customer was a couple of years after that.
Did you ever watch the BlackBerry story?
I did. Absolutely. And it's interesting to see how they evolved and moved and got caught up in a lot of different things, so to speak. But, there are some people who still love the BlackBerry today who would want it to come back because they loved how quickly they could get their messages back and forth.
I'm just thinking of that scene where they were talking about the scale and when they started actually getting a lot of usage and things started tipping over. Were there any like early moments of ramp that had you pulling out? Maybe you had hair at the time, but none left
Yeah, I
today.
know, exactly. Actually, not only did I have hair at the time, my beard was black. It wasn't white, which is and one of those things that you look back on and go, oh boy, where did the time go? The two things I will remember the most is the fact that the first customer check, August of 1998, was for $100. Few devices on the network, and I have a copy of that somewhere. I have to drag it out and find it and frame it and put it up somewhere. That was exciting because we knew we'd arrived. We got some revenue. That was the start, and we went forward. And the second one, which was very interesting, is that the two customers we had at the time, one was a business and alarm industry giant in the United States, and the second one was the largest commercial fleet tracking company in the United States. And they both pushed us in ways that we wouldn't normally have understood for reliability, service availability, things like that. They helped us drive perfectionism within the corporation, making sure that what we provided as a service ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without stopping. We established a ground rules within operations. I used to run engineering and operations in the early days and had about 2/3 of the company reporting to me back then. And I established a ground rule that said we shall do two things. One is make sure we're up all the time, set a 5 nines reliability, which gave us a budget downtime of 26 seconds a year, which is kind of tough to achieve, number one.
Right.
And number two, transparency. If we do go down, you can't guarantee the cellular behavior in the entire network, but we wanted to be able to tell our customers upfront, yeah, we've got a problem. And we acknowledge we've got a problem. We did not want to be the eventual giant that said, problem? What problem? We wanted to tell people before. And I established a rule within operations, which I hope to still live up to today, which is I want to know about problems before a customer calls us and says, you have a problem. That's the thing that we pride ourselves on.
So who were your early cellular partners, or were you running a tower out of your living room?
Very good question. Our network is somewhat unusual. Okay, we're not a mobile virtual network operator in the traditional use of the word. Like, I use the canonical examples of Virgin Mobile when the United States ran on the commercial mobile network operator over here. We were somewhere in between. We don't have towers, we don't have spectrum, but we took the data directly from the mobile switching centers. At that time, when we first began operations back in 97, 96 timeframe, the United States in particular didn't have these giant cellular operators in the country. Verizon didn't exist and AT&T Wireless didn't exist. There was a conglomeration of small operators, and there were about. We eventually had relationships, roaming agreements, and things like that with about 34 of them just in the United States alone.
Okay.
Six up in Canada, one or two in Mexico, for example. We started in North America, and so think of us as sort of a very intense network operator without spectrum. I joke about this, but it's really true. If we were to go get spectrum from the FCC or somewhere overseas and we were to go get a tower and put it up somewhere, we'd be a mobile network operator, just a traditional mobile network operator. The problem with that is A, it's expensive to get spectrum nowadays. Number two, putting up a tower somewhere doesn't guarantee you'll get a roaming relationship. You're starting to compete with the mobile operator, so we don't do that. But everything beyond that, we have the entire network to support data transmissions. In the early days, analog with our proprietary technology that we had, and late since then, all of the digital data techniques that people use for IoT day to day, SMS, IP data traffic, all the way through 5G. We pride ourselves on having the ability to do essentially software defined networks in many, many
Okay.
cases. When we first started out, we developed our own core network, and we use that. In some markets, we require local MNO might require us to use their network. But nowadays, we have the ability to provide not only our own core network for our business, but we acquired a couple of years ago all of the assets, the IoT assets of a giant corporation, Ericsson. This is public
Right.
information.
That was a
We
big
took over
one.
their IoTA business, and that meant that we're now supporting more than 30 mobile network operators around the world with essentially a branded capability. So there are some giant companies whom you will know about who have IoT capability that actually the underpinning is Aeris.
What was that moment like when you thinking about the evolution from starting in your dining room to acquiring Aeris? I mean, acquiring Ericsson. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Phenomenal. I think that we were growing steadily. We've had some hiccups because global economic hiccups took place in the 2000s era, and we recovered from them gracefully. Went and continued to grow and became profitable. So acquiring that Ericsson IoT business, where I kind of sort of described that as a minnow swallowing a whale kind of thing, right? I mean, we're a small company. We had a couple hundred people, and we were taking over a business that had more than 1,000 people.
Wild.
Acquiring their assets, global assets. We went from a company that at that time we had already deployed our own global network. We had, I think, about 4 or 5 offices around the world, although we have a handful of people who operate out of their homes, to 16, 15 or 16 entities around the world that were part of the Ericsson and IoTA network that became part of our core network. That transition established us. I mean, we became one of the largest providers of IoTA, all the way from essentially from the tower, not the device, from the tower through to the analytics. And in some cases, in some of our car company relationships, connected car company relationships, we actually provide the application that goes on the handset of the owner of the car.
So tell me about that. You live more on the connectivity side, but you're doing some hardware software as well. So where does the line stop?
Very good. Very good. We don't do devices. We consult with our customers, the enterprises who are out there who make the product, the hardware. We help them establish all of the things necessary to make sure their product is successful. We get very closely aligned with all the radio suppliers. So, for example, we have a company where they're making a medical product and they needed some certain capabilities inside the cellular radio that they've installed inside their product. And we had an excellent working relationship with the company that made that radio, and we provided them actually the little agent and the capability
Okay.
of saying this is what you need to incorporate. So we will write code from big soup to nuts. And in the case of our software-defined networks, we actually did all of our own development. Our HLR, the home location register in the 2G in the analog amps and the 2G networks. Now we have HSS, the home subscriber server in the 4G and 5G capabilities. We do our own, and that has been a necessary portion of implementing the network the way we do it because we can manage the cost. We have
Hmm.
visibility into the network. We get operational information such that our latest offerings in the area of IoT security allow us to have capabilities that a traditional MVNO or even some of the MNOs who don't have visibility into the roaming markets that their devices might be in, we have some special capabilities that allow us to do a better job.
So and I don't know if we can scrub it if this isn't appropriate, but last time we talked, you were doing a lot on communication pattern analysis and threat detection or anomaly detection over a network. Is that product prime time now?
It is. It is
Okay,
prime time.
cool.
So we have announced it. About 10, 15 years ago, we decided to have a product capability internal to our company where we would monitor the metadata of what these devices were
Sure.
doing out in the field. And that we gave us visibility into the behavior because our network operations people needed that. And, one of the early days kind of information that was always the case, even in IoT today, is that you don't know whether it's a device acting up or your network giving you a problem
Right.
if something's not working out in the field. And right in the early days, we recognized that we needed to provide capabilities to the customer directly and say they can isolate that, self isolate. Oh, it's my device. Oh, it's a network. And then they could contact us if it was a network issue, or they could recognize it was a device issue. And then they wouldn't even call us. They'd say, oh, yeah, it's my device. We need to go there. So we began analyzing metadata from the network, all of the operational control channel data, if you might call it that, to see how the devices were behaving out in the field. Well, we realized when we showed some of our customers one of our larger customers, how we were analyzing the data for them, they went, wow, can we have access to it? And we recognized that we had a capability that would give us the ability to take on this customer, give them the information because they needed it for their business. It was a fleet application. And we began to do that. And as a result of doing that, we also recognize that the whole space of IoT security, which, my first presentation on the topic goes back a long time, and I can talk about that next. We recognize that we have access to information that they didn't. The customers didn't. The enterprise didn't. The mobile network operators wouldn't see it if it bypassed their servers or they bypassed their IP networks and you had a local breakout somewhere in the world. We could see that data, and that would give us visibility into behavior patterns, which are very important. So if one of the nice things about IoT devices in general is that most applications, not everything, but almost the vast majority of applications have patterns. They operate in a very particular way. If you look at a fleet, and in particular, one of our fleet customers showed this to us, and it became a natural part of our recognition that there was a pattern, which is that on weekends, the traffic died down. It would be less than 20% of the traffic at a peak on Tuesday or Wednesday morning. And you'd see these little peaks, and you could see these very clear patterns. So in IoT, devices for a given customer or a given application tend to behave exactly the same way. And if there's a deviation, there's something wrong. There's something going awry. It may be the device that is misbehaving, or it might be a breach that has occurred in some way, a security breach that has occurred. We can recognize those patterns and watch the deviations from those patterns much more easily than a smartphone user might, right? So that gives us the ability to say, we know what's happening.
Hmm.
If you see a device and an application that's supposed to be connecting with server X in country Y, and all of a sudden it's transmitting to server something else in country A, something's
All
wrong.
traffic's going through the Caymans all of a sudden. What?
Exactly. What happened? And it could be not just one device, it could be a region, all devices in Egypt, they're operating on a
Hmm.
given carrier, all of a sudden are talking to somebody else that they shouldn't be. Sometimes it's legitimate. The customer has done an enterprise update to say, here's my new server, here's my new IP address. But more often than not, the way I look at it and the way our security product folks look at it now is any anomalous data is by definition suspicious until you prove otherwise. And that's how we recognize what's happening. We have demonstrated this product. We call it Aeris IoT Watchtower. We announced it at GSMA last year, and we've demonstrated to customers who are just fascinated by the fact that they get visibility into device behavior out in the field that they didn't know was happening to them. All the way to, I don't I want to be careful exactly what I do talk about, but I will tell you that we have seen some customers react with, oh my God, kind of, I didn't know my device was doing that. And sometimes they're legitimate. We had one
And
customer
so
whose radio
those
device was
are those
transmitting in
cases more typically software just not acting like, so maybe somebody updated the patch and there's like innocent, or how much of it is malicious versus unintentional?
significant portion of it is malicious, but not all of it for obvious reasons. But some of it is just behavior. When you do an OTA update, you have to show people that you can't just update all of your devices out in the field. You need to manage that. You need to orchestrate that you've done a certain number of devices, test it, make sure they're all working correctly, and maybe it's regional, and you distribute that OTA update in a careful way. Because if you end up with a situation where you brick all your devices, boy, the cost of trying to fix them later on is horrendous. You just wouldn't want to do that. So testing, sequential testing in a lab environment at their facility so they can undo the damage perhaps if they haven't taken care of it, and then go on from there. I will make one interesting observation, which I think is important. One time, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, I used to believe that OTA capability, over the air update capability, was a nice to have if your device was sufficiently powerful to do it. Today, I believe it's absolutely critical to have because the cost of repair whether it's because of a security breach or because you want to add a feature or something has gone awry, can be incredibly expensive. We learned that in the early days. The business and alarm industry guys came to us and said, hey, some of our devices, the cost of repair, sending a field technician, they called it a truck roll, is $250 to $400 per device. That's expensive. You don't want to do that unless you really, really, really have to. And sometimes the logistics of just finding a device, finding a location. In their case, they'd have they one a simple example. They had their device in a bank. They couldn't get in. Certain security issues had to be taken care of before even their technicians could get into the device. Another case I recall is that the business that they had sold their product to went out of business, and of course the doors were locked, so you couldn't even get in ever. And you had to contact the owner of the bank, the owner of the building, get a key. Long story short is that OTA is essential. It's become critical, and I make sure that any customer or potential enterprise developer that I talk to is making product, if they have the sufficient smarts, memory, etc., and they can add OTA capability. And sometimes it takes a little bit of extra, memory to hold multiple images, things like that. Do it. Test it. Make sure it's working properly before you put your product into the field.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Tell me a little bit about getting into regulated industries. So you started again on the kitchen table or the garage, and you're a big name in automotive now. So what was that like growing up journey for you and Eris?
That's an excellent question from the perspective that, we have been lucky that most of the regulations apply to the devices, frankly. So since we don't do the hardware, the customer itself develops the hardware, we advise them, we show them what needs to be done. They're the ones who go through the process of meeting the regulation. Now, does that mean we don't know? We don't have the experience? Then the answer is no. We can, like, FCC Part 15 in the United States, if you have a radio device, you're going to need to conform to that. We can help them walk through that process of meeting that regulation. What's happened is that if you look at more recently, the security regulations that have been developed, not just privacy, but security regulations that have been developed, particularly in Europe, like the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, and NIS2, which companies now need to conform to. And you look at Japan at the JC Star regulation that's coming along over there, and then there are variations of all of those over in the Far East. Meeting those regulations, we have to help customers with. And so we're trying to stay on top of that because our Watchtower product actually supports the reporting requirements on a timely basis that many of these regulations need. So regulations are a key driver of implementing security today. I have a little bit of perhaps an extreme statement. I think regulations are both good and evil. Let me explain what I mean by that. They're good because they're protecting people. Ultimately, regulations are developed by governments to protect people, whether it's privacy or other things, and that's extremely important. So it's good to have that. They're evil, maybe bad, in the sense that it meant that the industry hadn't done a sufficiently good job
Yeah, it's
of
reacting.
meeting.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were reacting to a problem, not thinking up front. And the cost of implementing security is non-trivial. It can be, 5 or 10 or 15% of the product cost ultimately. And you got to think through all of those issues. So regulations are a key driver. There are others. And so conforming and helping our enterprise customers meet those regulations is something I'm actively focused on right now, including this new project that I think I may have mentioned.
So the I2MC, tell us about this.
Yeah, the IoT M2M Council, it's called IMC, and the Global Certification Forum in Europe, which is GCF, decided that GCF has been focusing on certifying smartphones and cellular devices conforming to the GSMA standards for years. That's their business. They've been doing it for a long, long time. The IMC Council is a entity that essentially, think of it as one of the largest marketing entities to help people get into the IoT space in the world. And they have about 28,000 members and about 30 or 35 or maybe 40 corporations that participate at the board level. Aeris is one of the members of the IMC. Well, we decided that with all of these security regulations coming along and standards being enforced in various industries, you have the UN ECE regulations over in Europe for the European cars that are deployed in the 64 countries that the UN ECE applies to. You have the American regulations coming along, which are still in the works in many cases. The Europeans are ahead of us in that regard. We need to have the ability to certify the application device network and the cloud services component of an IoT application. Because traditionally people have looked at the device, and that's good. The vast majority of the regulations apply to the device, which is also good. But there are network regulations and there are cloud regulations for security that are not not as easily or well understood. And then there's the chain, right? End-to-end security. So about 10, 15 years ago, I did a webinar on end-to-end security for IoT, which was well received, but it was perhaps a bit early. People hadn't been thinking about that. And nowadays, people are worrying about end-to-end security from an IoT perspective. So these two entities, the IMC and the GCF, have created an organization, a task force, I should say, to investigate what it takes to implement certification to a regulation for IoT, what for end-to-end. And that's a very key point. There are three tracks. There's the technical track, the business track, and the process track. And I'm leading the technical track on that
Okay,
effort.
cool.
There are about 50 companies and brand names you'd recognize. It's all public. If you go onto the IMC website, you'll see a list of the companies that are participating.
How closely, so we've had the CRA deadline, it's 2027, right? 2027 is coming up.
Yep.
Are we on target, off target? Where's the industry at?
Darn good question. And actually one of the concerns that I have is that when you look at all of these regulations, they tend to tell you what they want done, not how to do it.
Yeah,
And so there's
exactly.
going to be a lot of effort implemented to implement the regulation requirements, right? That's the basic problem. The UNECE is kind of interesting. The automotive rules and regulations have been in place for 70 years, and they've implemented various pieces of that over the decades. Yeah, they regulate all kinds of behavior to have consistent automotive behavior around the world. Security is more recent. They came out with that some years ago, and June of 2024 is when those regulations went into effect, and you had to meet them. So that is an area, the best way to say it to respond to your question is that some regulations have been met in a good way. When you look at the CRA, I'm still concerned that the rules and requirements in play means that we still don't know exactly what we will need to do to meet them. I'm hopeful that the regulators will be relatively lenient in the beginning, just like the GDPR
So we've
implementations
got a
were, meaning
whole 18 months to write this down when
you
then
bet.
it takes 2 years to get it to production for hardware vendors.
Exactly right. And devices can take a significant amount of time. If you're not buying an off the shelf hardware product, you're developing your own, you need to think through exactly what it means to do that. So I advise people who are making product, you have to conform to CRA if you want to sell product in Europe. Therefore, look now. Find the right partner who can help the product, the embedded code that you might need to implement certain security functions. Absolutely. Very, very important.
Where do you think the leading edge hardware is happening in the world right now? I mean, you probably have a really nice map of connectivity and your customers, but I think you probably see some nice macro trends. So where are more devices coming online and who's actually in front here?
You know, China is the largest by far. Mainland China has by far the most IoT devices deployed internal to the country. So that's kind of interesting. Various applications like smart buildings, smart homes, and things like that, and connected cars, because it's a very large internal vehicle market, if you will, over there. So they're probably the largest. I mean, if you look at the top 10 IoT devices that are out there, the top three are Chinese mobile network operators. That's the way it is. And then next after that is probably some of the larger operators that have IoT capability that they've deployed over in Europe and on a global basis. So you see that happening a lot. From our perspective, I mean, I forget the numbers right now, but it's semi-public information in the sense that anyone wants it, we can tell them. We have more than 90 million devices. That puts us in the top 10 cellular IoT devices,
Wow.
which is a large number. And the distribution is interesting. Prior to the Ericsson acquisition, the majority of it was in the United States for obvious reasons, North America, I should say. After the Ericsson acquisition, it's sprinkled just about everywhere. Europe is probably our second largest market by far, and with Ericsson over there, one could juggle numbers and say it's pretty high over there. The IoTA system does have some Far Eastern mobile network operators that we're supporting, so you're starting to see growth in there in Japan and Singapore, the Bridge Alliance, things like that. Africa, by the way, I shouldn't overlook this. Surprisingly enough, Africa is a nascent market. We actually have a dominant role in solar panel monitoring, for example, in Africa for our
Interesting.
customers. Now, when I say we, I mean our customer, our enterprise customer.
Yeah, I have a hunch, or maybe I've heard that it's easier to get cellular down there than it is to actually get connected to broadband. And so maybe that's it's just quicker and cheaper to get the devices than the actual infrastructure.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And low cost devices in many cases. But IoT, obviously, if you have a custom product, it's going to be a little bit trickier.
What is the weirdest thing you've ever seen come online?
Let me rephrase that a little bit. We've had customers come to us and say, "Can you do this?" And
Hmm.
our reaction is, "Oh my God." And I have my canonical, I call it the howler monkey problem. And I said, "What the heck is a howler monkey problem?" Well, we had somebody, you may or may not be aware of this, but in San Diego, right, there's this giant park zoo, right? The San Diego National Zoo is famous. And they frequently have their howler monkeys escape. And you can hear these monkeys from miles away. And they wanted to track these. And I went, oh my God, how are we going to put devices on the monkey to figure out where they're located, charge the batteries, all
They're
of the usual
smart.
things?
They can take
Yeah,
things off, I'm sure.
that too. So I call
Yeah.
it the traditional howler monkey problem is that some things you just can't have to give up on that.
So how many monkeys are on the network?
Oh, I have no idea. None. I would suspect. I have no idea. That company kind of sort of decided they didn't want to do anything with this. Uh, and we've always had people who don't understand, at least from our network perspective, cellular IoT is you've got to be careful. We've had people who wanted to track whales, and my reaction is you can't do that. There's no cellular out in the middle of nowhere, number one. And even if you have the remote possibility that they come close to land, underwater, you're not gonna get wireless transmissions. It's not gonna happen. So there are some applications that just don't make sense. But there are others that are absolutely fascinating. The thing that I like to tell people is that I can recognize a smartphone anywhere in the world. It looks like a Apple iPhone or a Samsung Android device of some sort, no keypads, or it might be a low cost cellular phone which just has a keypad, doesn't have data capability, etc., etc. I cannot recognize IoT devices. If I walk up to a vending machine, does it have an IoT device in there or not? It might not. If I walk up to a medical grade medical device of some sort, does it have IoT transmission capability? Well, it might. It might have a short range Bluetooth or a Wi Fi capability, but does it have cellular? I don't know. So IoT is becoming pervasive. And that to me is the most fascinating aspect of what has happened in the industry is that we're impacting markets for remote data and remote control in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And I'm just fascinated by the kind of applications. I once did a presentation to some high school kids and I said, have you been on a plane? And I said, and some of them responded with a yeah. And I said, have you looked out of the plane and seen these giant crop circles? And they went, yeah. I said, well, what are those? They're water irrigation systems, right?
Okay.
And I said, they're being monitored. Why? Because you may need to change the delivery of the water. You may need to have one crop get a certain amount of water and a different crop get a different amount of water. And how do you change that? Well, in the old days, they'd have somebody out there tweaking the water controls to deliver a certain amount of water because the crop changed. And what if you made a mistake? What if the arm jammed? These things are huge. They're enormous. They're sometimes a quarter mile, half a mile, even hundreds of yards, hundreds of meters that would allow the water to be distributed in a circle and they've jammed. Well, how do you know they've jammed? Before monitoring, there was a guy or more than one
Right.
running around with a truck watching them. That's the kind of stuff, the efficiencies that you don't anticipate IoT being used for. It's fascinating to see what people come up with.
Sure. And consumer product development is always very risky, but these B2B applications and efficiency applications, I mean, they're revenue positive very, very early on. I mean, it's clear value add. Yeah.
I used to in the early days, it was difficult to go into a company and prove the value of remote data and remote control. But today, that's the norm. It's just a matter of figuring out what people want. Today, the burden of proving something is necessary has shifted to security, IoT security. Got to show them this is the things you need to be concerned about.
What are you seeing in the AI space? Is this changing your traffic, changing how people are using products, sending more data to the edge? Is this a hype cycle? What do you think's happening?
It's a big question. It's a big question that I think needs careful thought. I'll say it in the following way. AI is the next big hype, right? Everything is quote unquote AI today. And we have this big scare factor going on about how it can take over the world and all those kinds
Mhm.
of things. I am, as you can probably tell from my white hair, I'm old enough to have known some of the pioneers in AI years ago. My first college class in AI was, oh God, far too long. And I got taught by some of the people who were pioneers at that time. And I'll tell you that what we're talking about as being AI today isn't that. Large language model, data processing, machine analytics is not AI was supposed to stand for.
Right.
It's a good term. And I'm okay with that. And people are starting to use it in ways that um, analytics, providing the data, making sure that you're getting the right information and processing it the right way is where AI excels. And it can excel in ways that go beyond the normal human processing. And I'll be careful how I say this. When you have millions of devices out in the field and you're processing quite literally billions of data messages per day, without machine learning, without AI tools to allow you to find the nuggets of information that matter, we'd be stuck. Okay,
Sure.
so AI
Yeah.
makes lot of sense. And the application of large models like that to data being gathered for IoT devices makes a lot of sense. So it's a good thing. It's the right thing. My concern lies in two areas. One is that AI is being used by the attackers. You may have developers in a company that are doing the embedded product, and they're spending 10 or 15% of their time thinking about security, hopefully at least that much. The attackers spend 100% of the time thinking about new ways to penetrate devices and networks, and IoT is the next surface. That is becoming very clear because you have billions of devices out there. So that's one concern. The second one is automation. And I've said this in a recent quote, which is that taking action automatically, which is where agentic AI perhaps is the sort of the next frontier, where I've got the data, I've done the analytics, and now I want to take automated action because it is A, I need to do it quickly. A human may not respond in time. Number two, there may be still a lot of action that needs to be automated and take place. Well, my concern is that until we develop trust in those actions, you got to be careful.
Right.
If I'm gathering data from a remote sensor that's measuring a water meter or a temperature sensor in a building or smart home application, that's one thing. If I cut it off because it's been breached, or I cut it off because it's sending data to the wrong location, or the bad download occurred and now it's being used for denial of service, like the camera hack that took place about 10 years ago. Okay, that's one thing. But if I have a medical device, and there are criticalities of medical devices as well, do I want to cut it off? Am I going to harm a human being? That's when I start worrying about automation and AI. And until we develop further trust, until we understand the repercussions of taking automated action, human oversight is essential. And then
Yep.
you get to the point where you build up that trust and implement.
Yeah, these systems are probabilistic in nature, and we're at the benefit of being able to program hard rules in for years and years and years, and it's there's a lot of nice to haves with AI systems, but you definitely need to have the clear guardrails for that sanity check at the end of the day.
And it's very application dependent, right? And I have this chart that someone showed recently, that I put together, that someone showed recently at a conference, ranging from a sensor on a wall to a national grid infrastructure, electrical utility grid, where you may need to worry about exactly what actions you take.
How close are you guys to the silicon vendors? Is that a space? Do you collaborate with them very much, or is it kind of a hands off, like a handoff, throw it over the wall?
Good relationship, but not direct, in the sense that in the past, when people were working on data transports like our own proprietary transport in the beginning, we were very close to the module makers, the radio module makers,
Okay.
and beyond. A little bit beyond that, we had interactions with the companies who make the chipsets that go into the cellular devices. Today, we're a little further away because the data transports are more standard, if you will, because they don't incorporate our proprietary technology. When you have IP data on cellular is well governed by standards from the GSMA for LTE and 5G, for example. We don't get involved in that level. However, we have some special capabilities that we developed years ago for better performance. IoT devices have to be more reliable than a human being's smartphone in a sense, right? Coverage detection, for example. A smartphone, if it doesn't have coverage, the user is going to walk closer to a different window or find another place where they get coverage. IoT devices don't have that luxury, and sometimes they don't even recognize they have a need for better performance. And so we help companies work on that. And reliability from a longevity perspective. A smartphone dies, the purchaser is going to go to a store, replace it, etc. So the 2 to 4 to 5 year kind of longevity of a smartphone is very different from a device that's been installed in the last 10, 15 years. We have some companies who are making battery operated devices that they want to have work for 10, 15 years. Well, battery technology for that kind of a transmission needs to be thought through. So we work closely, but not hand in hand with the silicon and suppliers. Module makers, yeah, we work closely with them just to make sure that we understand what capabilities it have. We do testing in the early days with connected car applications, for example, which are devices in motion. I like to distinguish devices in physical motion from devices that are static
Hmm.
on a wall somewhere. Devices in motion have to worry about multiple networks that they're transitioning through. So we used to do drive testing. We'd stick their device into a car and drive through a circuit that we had near our corporate offices in California, where they'd go through 6 or 7 different switch changes, 2 or 3 different operators, just to see what the device would do when it switched. In an IoT application, it's not like the user can power cycle a device trivially.
Well, this has been a really interesting and fun episode to host. I'd like, before we close, to take it back kind of to the beginning and where we are today. If you were to start working on something right now, and maybe this is just pitching somebody to build out Eris's future roadmap, but what would you focus on if you were starting from ground zero again?
That's a darn good question. I think the best way I would respond to that is to say to find the right device that serves a need that can grow. And to me, that space is in the medical area, frankly, because I think that human impacts are the most visible IoT impact that we can have. Like I said, we don't recognize IoT applications everywhere, but if we can do good for people, whether it's in a medical application like I'm talking about, or even, one of our customers, for example, is worrying about vaccine monitoring in Africa. Vaccines have a very narrow temperature range over which they have to be kept. And if you don't store it that way, you might as well be injecting distilled water into a child. That kind of good, I think, is important. Our CEO at one time, not the current CEO, but our previous CEO, wanted to have that be one of the mainstays of corporate. The best way to say it is corporate good. Do some
Mm,
good in the world, and I
yeah.
think that's very important. So if you can find that right area that you could get into, whether it's medical or doing something related to medical to help human beings, I would love to be able to do something like that. So I'd recommend. I did a presentation at a conference in India, a virtual conference in India, where I said, this was post-COVID, where detection. If you look at what's happening out there with the medical devices, like small, cheap, low-cost medical devices for blood sugar monitoring, they're very easy to get. Well, what if we could find one that would do virus detection? And there's a
Mm,
company, there's an organization in the UK, I believe, that has discovered that the VOCs in human breath can be used to analyze what disease they might have. Wonderful. Can we make a product that the little sensor can be modified out there that tracks different viruses? And instead of COVID-19 being an issue, maybe it's COVID-27 that comes along, and now we have a new epidemic in the world that we can detect sooner so we can isolate quicker. That, I think, would be a fascinating product.
amazing. Really cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Really enjoyed the episode. It's great to catch up again, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Good to speak to you, Bill. Thank you very much.
All right. Talk
Take
soon.
care. Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. Just a quick reminder, this podcast is presented by Peridio, the ecosystem for building and maintaining advanced embedded products.